Nous allons donc reprendre avec ce deuxième panel. Et je dois dire que pour nous, associations qui accompagnons depuis des années des personnes qui sont en situation de prostitution, nous savons à quel point leurs paroles souvent se livrent difficilement, lentement, qu'il faut un temps pour que les choses se disent, souvent dans le huis clos associatif. Et nous savons à quel point il est difficile de passer de cet environnement protégé à une parole en public. Et donc, c'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, je suis particulièrement émue et puis particulièrement fière d'être assise ici, parmi vous, mesdames, survivantes de la prostitution, qui un jour avaient décidé de prendre la parole, de parler publiquement, de dire les choses, de dire la violence, de dire la vérité, et de nous apporter des témoignages qui sont inestimables, puisque votre parole, évidemment, est la parole vraie, et que là où nous, associations, nous expliquons ce que nous voyons, mais nous sommes dans une position qui n'est pas celle des personnes qui ont véritablement vécu, qui ont eu l'expérience. Et donc cette parole, la parole des survivantes, est véritablement importante. Elle est difficile, on sait qu'il faut du temps et il a fallu du temps pour que commencent à s'organiser à travers le monde des réseaux de survivantes qui se regroupent, comme par exemple dans le cas de Space International. Et pour nous, c'est extrêmement important de pouvoir entendre ces voix-là. Et je suis vraiment, vraiment très fière d'être donc parmi vous aujourd'hui. Alors la prostitution, nous la dénonçons depuis toujours comme une violence. Ça a été rappelé dans les différentes interventions ce matin. Une violence physique, une violence psychique, une violence qui détruit, et qui d'autre, bien sûr, que les personnes qui l'ont connue pourraient le mieux en parler. Donc c'est sur cet aspect aujourd'hui, ce matin, que nous allons écouter les témoignages des personnes que je vais vous présenter et qui vont parler donc successivement. Et je vais commencer par vous, Vednita Carter, qui venez des États-Unis. Vous allez nous parler de la violence que vous avez subie dans la prostitution, de la manière dont cela vous a affecté dans votre vie, mais aussi comment vous avez transformé tout cela et comment vous avez décidé de créer une organisation, Breaking Free, pour maintenant être vous-même auprès d'autres personnes qui vivent ces situations de prostitution et les aider à prendre en main leur destin à leur tour. Merci Vednita, c'est à vous.
So thank you, Vednita, and you have the floor.
Thank you. I've been working with women and girls who have been involved in prostitution since 1989. And I began working with the prostituted population because of my own experiences. As a young woman, I got involved in what is known as, well, it was called dancing, but it's better known as stripping. And I think people have heard of the strip industry. It had just came to the state that I live in, Minnesota, and a friend of mine and myself were wanting to go to college and wanted to make some money before going to college. We thought we'd have some spending money that fall. So we both answered an ad that said dancers needed. We didn't realize it was strippers needed, of course, until after a while of being involved in it. But we went for an interview, we were fully dressed, everything seemed to be dancing. We both got hired. When we started dancing, we were fully dressed. We were making what they said you'd make $1,000 a week. So that's what we were making when we first started. One thing after another happened, and I'll tell you, it changed the course of my life forever. Both she and I got separated pretty much after about a couple months. She went down one road, I went down another road. You know, they say that stripping is a stepping stone into prostitution. Immediately after a couple months, they began to insist that we start taking our tops off and our bottoms off. And before you know it, we were deeply involved in this industry. I lost contact with her after about 4 or 5 months, and I won't go into the details of it that were very horrific for me. I was able to get out of this life in about a year, and it was not easy. I ended up calling a friend of mine who used to be a teacher of mine, actually, at the high school that I attended, and I told her what was happening to my life. I had been accepted, like I said, into a college, and I never did make it there at that particular time. I told her that I had gotten involved in this with my friend, who I don't know what happened to her, had not spoken to her for many years. My friend came and picked me up from where I was and let me stay with her. And I stayed with her for about a year. And it took me about a year to heal from all of the abuse, the prostitution that happened. I realized that that was one of the main means of making money, was to service many of the men who were going into these establishments. In any case, I'll say about 5 years ago, I ran into my friend, who's in her 50s. Hadn't seen her since I was 18 years old. And I asked my friend what happened to her. And what she told me was that her boyfriend had just died. And her boyfriend happened to be a pretty hardcore pimp that she met while involved in that life of stripping. And so some people might think that this is unusual, but it really is not unusual. This happens to women, and it happens to girls all the time. I had just turned 18, but the girls that were dancing with me or stripping with me were 16 and 17-year-old girls. They had fake IDs. The owners of these establishments helped them to get fake IDs. It was not hard, but this happens all the time. I want to say the average age of entry into prostitution, at least in the United States, is between 12 and 14 years old. At Breaking Free, we work with women and girls. We work with at least 400 to 500 women and girls a year. And what we found out from the ladies that we work with, the average woman started at age 13. So you have to begin to think about this. You have to think, when a child gets involved in the life of prostitution, what's happening in her life? What's going on with her to make her get involved in prostitution? Did she choose it? Was this her choice? I always say that little girls don't daydream about becoming prostituted women when they grow up. And if they do daydream about it, we know that there is something happening in their world, in their life, that is so horrific to make her think that this is a lifestyle that she would want to be involved in. At Breaking Free, we provide a multitude of services that help women and girls to get out of prostitution. We look at prostitution, of course, as you've heard, as violence against women. We definitely know that it is violence against women. I'll say since 1989, I've worked with thousands of women and girls, helping them to escape this life. And the lady that was up here at the panel prior, Anna, read a little quote from Rosa Parks. And I thought that was very powerful, because she mentioned how during slavery, which we know that prostitution is definitely an extension of slavery, it's a new age form of slavery right now against women and girls. Rosa Parks read, or Anna read the quote from Rosa Parks stating that during slavery, that slaves would have to act like they liked what was happening to them. They enjoyed the abuse that was being done to them. And so whenever their master died, they'd take a finger and wet their cheeks and make it look like they were crying. I'm going to tell you, when you're involved in prostitution, you become another person. You have to wear a lot of hats in prostitution, and one of those hats is to say, I like what's happening to me. This is all right. This is not so bad. And the reason that you do that is because you know you have to do that. It's a survival mechanism. It's a survival mechanism to let people think that what is going on in your life is not so bad, because you know you have to go back to that life. And especially if you have a pimp, you know that there is no other life that you can go back to but to prostitution. So you continue to tell people that this is what I do. I make a lot of money and it's not so bad. But then when you go home and you sit in front of that mirror and you look at yourself and you think, now why? Why can't I just walk away from this? What's happening to me to make me stay in this? And there's many reasons. The same tactics of power and control that keep battered women trapped in their domestic situations are the same tactics of power and control that keep prostituted women trapped in their situations. You're isolated, you're threatened. Many things happen to you in that life that people don't understand. This is not Pretty Woman. It's nothing like Pretty Woman. This is the truth of what happens. You know, we do a variety of groups at Breaking Free with women because when women come through our door, immediately they're pointing the finger at themselves. They're saying, this is my fault. This is something that I did to myself. I deserve what's happening to me. So what our groups do is we take them through a series of 14 weeks. And basically what we're doing is we're really trying to help them to become deprogrammed from everything that they've heard and from everything that they believe about who they are. It's said, and we've heard it up here, that prostitution's been around for a long time. It's known as the oldest profession. Breaking Free likes to call it the oldest oppression against women and girls. That's what it is. And so when the women come to our groups, I sometimes will facilitate those groups. So this particular group that I facilitated, I happen to have a lot of young girls in the group. And when I say young, I mean about 16, 17, all the way up to 40, 50 years old. So I began to ask them, what do you like about prostitution? What's good about it? And they began to say, I like the cars. I like the money I make. I like the clothes, the fancy clothes that I wear. And I just let them talk because they need to get that out. They need to understand. So I said, tell me, what clothes did you wear? See, prostitution is not nothing nice. So some of the things that I'm going to say are going to be a little harsh, a little hard, because you can't make this pretty, this situation a pretty situation and say nice things about it. So the girls started saying that they get dressed up, that they meet these good-looking guys, that they make all of this money. And I said, you do? I said, well, tell me, what do you wear? What do you wear? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, what clothes do you wear? You said that you wear a lot of pretty clothes. And I said, they just kept saying dresses, clothes. I said, well, you know, the act of prostitution, you don't wear anything. You don't wear anything during the act of prostitution. What the act of prostitution is ugly. I said, tell me now. Now, you've told me all the pretty things about it. There's about 30 women in this particular group. I said, you've told me all the pretty things about it. Now I want you to tell me how you felt when you got down on your knees, he told you to open your mouth. It gets really quiet. I want you to tell me how you felt. This is prostitution. You can't keep it nice. When he told you to lay down on your stomach, and he did whatever he wanted to do to your body. It got real quiet in the room, just like it's getting real quiet in here. This is what prostitution is. Some of the ladies started to cry. I said, now, would this be all right if your daughter were involved in this? If your sister got involved in prostitution and she had to do these very same things? See, what happens is we know that women from the United States say that on a daily basis, they're with between 5 to 10 guys. They're servicing that many guys a day. Now, Breaking Free, we work from women from all over the United States and out of the country that come to us. Now, the women that are staying in our housing program, what they tell us, the ladies from Thailand, is that they service at least 40 guys a day. Let's talk about this being pretty. Let's talk about this being good. And what I like to say to people is, I don't care if you've never been involved in it, because it impacts every woman, no matter who you are, no matter where you are. I try to get them to see it from a different viewpoint. Your husband, the person you love, your boyfriend, he wants to come into you 5 times a day, 10 times a day. Let's just say 40 times a day. How would that make you feel? Where would your head be with him? This is a person that you love. You see him every day, day in and day out. Something up here would change. It would change the way you think. It would change the way you feel. It penetrates deep down into the spirit. It begins to form the way we think every day. You know, they say women involved in prostitution, lots of people say, are just plain crazy. And you know what? You do become crazy. You have to. In order to service and to be with men that you may never even give the time of day, men that you may not even say hello to, men as old as your father and your grandfather, as young as your brother, your dad. You have to think about this. This is what prostitution is. The hats you wear are many in prostitution. When I was involved in the strip industry, I stayed at home and I was raised by my grandmother. And my phone was constantly ringing at home. We didn't have cell phones back then, so it was a house phone. It's time to go. You got to do this, you got to go here, you got to go there, and then I'd have my boyfriend pick me up. But what I would tell my grandmother, what I would tell my siblings, I got a job that's busy, keeps me busy. See, when I'm at home, I put on a different hat when I'm with them, because I don't want them to know what's going on. I don't want them to know how horrific my life is. I'm too embarrassed, and I'm feeling like I can't get out. And actually, I really couldn't get out. I had to sneak out. See, 98% of the women that we work with at Breaking Free are chemically dependent. And what they tell us is that we just can't seem to do the act. Prostitution is about an act of sex. And it's nothing else. It doesn't matter what you hear. Prostitution is about a sex act with a stranger, many strangers that you don't know, that you don't really want to know on a daily basis. I call it torture. I call it rape to the highest extreme. There's many names that I call it. How do we end this? What do we have to do? See, it's been a long time now, women being stigmatized for something that's happened to them. That's why we call them prostituted women. It means something's been done to them, not prostitutes. It means that these are women who were born with a purpose, that have a destiny, and someone has stolen that. There's only one thing that we can do, and we all have to do it together. I'm so happy that men are here today. Somebody mentioned earlier this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that multi-billion dollars is coming out of the pockets of many men. We have to end this by stopping the demand. Once men start putting their foot down and say, we're not having it, you're not buying our women, you're not selling our women and children, then we're going to see a change all over the world. All over the world. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Vednita pour la force de ces paroles, pour nous rappeler qu'effectivement, oui, la prostitution, c'est bien la plus vieille oppression du monde. Et je voudrais maintenant passer la parole à Mia de Fuica, qui nous vient d'Irlande, qui préfère parler debout, donc elle va se rendre au pupitre, qui va parler également de son expérience, elle qui est maintenant étudiante de philosophie.
My name is Mia, and I think therefore I am. For I will never deny where heroin and prostitution brought me, but I refuse to let it define who I am today. Because if it defines me, it becomes me, and it is not all I am. The purchase of another human being for sex, it is not and never has been the purchase of sex. because neither I nor any other woman stand on the street or in the brothels with our genitalia or our mouths and our throats in neatly wrapped packages which you could borrow and return to us. No, I had to go with them. You had to talk to me first. My mind was present the whole time. You always have to buy the person before you gain access to their body. The first principle of equality, as I heard Simon Hagstrom, one of Europe's leading protectors of human dignity, describe, is that no human being should have control over the body of another human being, and that is what prostitution is. My first experience of violence was extreme, as it came in the form of a gang rape that lasted for what seemed like forever, and in many ways it will, for from that night on I no longer lived, I just existed, and in a world I could no longer comprehend, I could no longer make sense of. I left a building with a bruised body and face, smelling of urine and bleeding from my rectum. Do you now understand how I couldn't see the choices anymore? And the only reason I coped was through disassociation. The young woman who was with me that night did not survive. Her drug use spiraled out of control and she died alone of an overdose about 2 months later. To many, her death may be just another sad statistic, but to me, her life will always be of value. The events of that night exposed me to such human wickedness, but apart from my own endurance, it tore me apart to witness what was left of a young 27-year-old woman's sanity disappear before my very eyes. And there is a little boy now who will grow up never knowing just how hard his mother was trying to get away. He will never know how kind and wonderful she was. Prostitution has robbed him of that and from countless other children as well. My next rape was a year or so later by a lone offender off the street where I stood. The next, I'm not sure if I can call it rape. It happened the same night. I was sitting on the ground on the street after the attack. My money and my phone had also been taken. Just sitting, disorientated and alone, with an aching body and a struggling mind. When a regular of mine pulled up, he got out of the car, picked me up and offered to drive me home. I told him what had happened and he even stopped and bought me a coffee. But just before we reached my home, he pulled in and reminded me that I had no money to pay him, but that I could sort him out. I didn't even argue. I just leaned back and let him. So what do you call that? Someone who's sex with a woman they know has been raped about an hour or so beforehand. My last rape was by 2 young men high on cocaine. One watched as the other one did it, but to me he is just as guilty. I have countless accounts of humiliations, being urinated upon, etc., of oral rape. In fact, I have no gag reflex. The muscles at the back of your throat learn to relax, and they have to. We are already considered the lowest of the low. What I'm trying to say is that if you set up the conditions for rape, it will happen. And I don't mean myself and my friend alone in an apartment with 8 men. We as prostituted women are a prime target for any buyer who wants to fulfill the violent sexual crime of rape. Only with us they can do it and get away with it. And both society and the laws that govern it play a major role in keeping it that way. And it will remain unpunishable while it remains legal to buy another human being in the first place. So now, for me, heroin had become a lifeline to cope with being bought, where it began with selling myself to cope with heroin. Welcome to the paradox that so very few of us escape from. I am one of the lucky few. We exist out there underneath the shadow of the constant threat of violence. A dark cloud of fear hovers around us permanently. But it is the fear as Aristotle would describe, where fear is the pain you feel on the anticipation of the arrival of evil. And in prostitution, that evil arrives all too often. But the most frightening thing about this kind of fear is that it is state-sanctioned. Prostitution and sex trafficking are intrinsically linked. You have one because of the other. For the last 18 months of my time on the street, I stood alongside a trafficked woman. She became my closest friend, and I have never seen a human being so broken down. The conditions under which she lived were so inhumane that she had developed a twisted sense of loyalty to her controller, and so that someone had trafficked her from home right across Europe and finally landing in Ireland. At this stage, she had been completely broken down. His control was all that she knew. He would beat her if she was challenging, kept her passport. She was put on the street at 6 p.m. and stayed there until 5 a.m. every night. She was addicted to crack cocaine, and he was the dealer. She had to return with every 100 euros. She made nothing. But although we had arrived at the same place through different means, we are connected because we were bought, used, exploited, humiliated, and raped by the same buyers. One night I would be bought, and a few nights later the same man could buy her. And on a couple of occasions we were bought together. And that connection can never be broken by anyone at any time in any country. I used to think that as bad and as disconnected as my own life was, at least I got to go home at night. But I find it unimaginable to think of what it must be like to be in a country where you know no one and maybe you don't even speak the same language. I will end the story of my African friend with one of the saddest things I have ever seen. And for me, it puts it all into perspective. I was home one night alone, as my daughter had become ill and needed some inpatient care. My phone rang. There had been a row between her trafficker, and another girl. I told her to come to my home as I was on my own. I had always kept home and the street completely separate. She arrived, crying uncontrollably. I had never seen her so upset. I hugged her and checked her wounds, as she had blood all over her hands. But thankfully, everything was superficial. It doesn't really matter what the fight was about. Drugs, control, etc. I made her a coffee and we had a cigarette. I said I would run her a bath as she looked exhausted. I ran the bath and called her in. I left her to relax and went into another room. I was closing my window when she called me. I turned around and what I saw shocked me to the core. For there in front of me, my friend stood naked, but she had the body of a child. Her ribs stuck out. There were no breasts. It was covered in old bruises, new bruises, scratches. She looked like someone who'd just been released from a concentration camp. My eyes welled up, but I didn't want her to see me cry, so I brought her into the bathroom again. She had called me to wash her hair as her arms were sore. I washed her hair, took her out of the bath, and she sat in between my legs on the floor as I blushed and blow-dried her hair. She was humming just like a child. I put her to bed and sat beside her until she fell asleep. And then I cried for the lost child I had just put to bed. I'll never forget the image I saw that night. But this wasn't a concentration camp in Poland in 1945. This was my apartment, Dublin, 2010. There was no war, but there is no law to protect either. Protecting the good citizen. I believe this is where some people struggle, because for the most part, the men who buy human beings for sex are exactly that. They are good citizens in that they are in gainful employment, so they pay their taxes, they pay their rent, or buy homes with their partners. They have 2.4 children. They tick every box that society deems to be correct. So we allow them this little indulgence. How we allow it again through silence and keeping it legal. For the men who bought me and all the other women, the men that feed this twisted industry, they walk among you every day. They are fathers, husbands, colleagues. We don't want to acknowledge that the good citizen can behave like a bad human being. I understand that fear, for we hate to upset society's little apple cart. But at whose expense do we do that? I, on the other hand, would be viewed as a bad citizen. I didn't have a job. I was supported by the state. I was a heroin addict. And worst of all, I stood on a public street, displaying my wares, luring these good citizens to me, as if they had no choice. But I am a good human being. I always have been. And this is the balance you must find between the good citizen and the good human being, and which one of us comes first in the queue for protection. So how do we ensure that that happens? Well, we follow Sweden's lead. Sweden placed human dignity first. they fully understand the concept of human dignity, which is the value and respect we place on one another as human beings. What happens when we place human dignity first, as Sweden has proved beyond doubt, is that the good triumphs, whereas in countries that have placed it last, evil thrives, as is abundantly evident in the countries that have either decriminalised, legalised, or under tolerating regimes. That evil is both human trafficking and the place where vulnerable women and children are trafficked into, which is prostitution, where they join the addicted, disconnected, and damaged women like myself, who are also trapped, but in a different way, to service the wants of a particular group of men. I believe that most evils in the world are committed by nobodies. And furthermore, I believe it is now time that the nobodies were brought to bear and made accountable and responsible for the cruel industry and slave trade they willingly sustain and uphold. In fact, it only exists because of them. I would like nothing more than for the police who tried, but in vain, to protect me, to be given the green light to do exactly that, to be given the powers and legislation that will fine offenders, jail the real pimps and coercers, and send out a clear message to the traffickers that women are no longer for sale, because there is no anti-trafficking law which is more powerful than getting the use of another man's slave. This law is about the protection of the most vulnerable human beings, many of whom are being rescued with barcodes and bondage debts tattooed to their bodies. I do not believe that Europe's memory is that short. This law is about the protection of human dignity and freedom. And when human dignity is in jeopardy and human lives are endangered, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. The one sure thing that 6 years of deeply personal anthropological insight into sexual exploitation has taught me is that prostitution is not compatible with humanity, and we either choose one or the other.
Je pense que vous êtes conscient que c'est toujours très difficile d'enchaîner après des témoignages comme cela. Merci beaucoup, Mia. Et je vais tout de suite donner la parole à Tanja Rahm, qui vient du Danemark, qui a connu la prostitution également, qui est diplômée en éducation sociale et qui va dans quelques jours lancer également un réseau, le Network Group de survivants au Danemark.
Network group of survivors in Denmark. The floor is yours.
After 3 years in prostitution, I almost jumped out a window from the 3rd floor. That was how prostitution made me feel, that I had nothing to live for. I had been sexually violated so many times that there was almost nothing left of me, neither inside or outside. I was nothing. I was worth nothing. I felt completely useless. I was a machine for other people's amusement, their sexual desires, and their perverse exploitation. I spent 9 years in therapy to get where I am today. And even though I persist in telling about the violence experienced in prostitution, I still live with the traumas and the re-traumatizing by telling about it. But we, as survivors, have to. We have to keep on telling about the violence, so no one will ever forget or be manipulated into thinking that prostitution is even close to something you can define as sex work. Prostitution is a massive industry using and abusing people in desperate life circumstances. It's a social phenomenon in which brothel owners, pimps and traffickers achieve the biggest economic benefits on behalf of other people's desperation for basic survival and economical security. The buyers are the direct cause of the exploitation that takes place in prostitution. They are the ones demanding for the supply of new, young, innocent girls and women. Using the term sex work is a way to glorify what happens in prostitution, and it's a way to seduce society to think that prostitution is a free choice, and that you can compare it with other professions. The term sex work intends to normalize and ignore the harm prostitution causes. Using the term sex work is a violation of basic human rights, because the term sex work intends to remove focus from the harm, exploitation, and abuse that takes place in prostitution, rather than to illuminate the commercialization that has become more and more prevalent, especially when it comes to women's bodies and sexuality. The prostitution lobby talks about prostitution as a part of women's sexual liberation. They state that the choice of going into prostitution is individual and that it's an expression of women's right to do with their body as they please. They describe prostitution as a way for women to choose for themselves when it comes to the capitalization of human sexuality. The problem is that they choose on behalf of all women in the world. They choose to capitalize women's sexuality in general. I see no link between prostitution and sexual liberation. I consider prostitution as oppressive and as a lack of recognition that women have a right to a life where their sexuality is not commercialized, and where society takes care of the people who are exploited, abused, and marginalized in prostitution. Society should take responsibility for people who don't have the choice, and the women who don't have a voice in the debate of prostitution. Women who actually have a choice, have the choice to choose something else. Many women don't have that choice. Prostitution is buyer's market. Prostitution is based on the conditions of the buyers. Prostitution exists in the hands of criminals. Prostitution is an area that houses trafficked people, vulnerable people, self-harming people, poor people, and people in different kinds of abuse. The majority of the people in prostitution can be divided into these groups. On the 18th of November, I launch a new survivor group in Denmark. None of the women whom I have been in contact with recognize this picture sex lobbyists have painted of prostitution being sex work or sexual liberation. These women talk about prostitution as a part of survival, destructive behavior, and the lack of choices. Prostitution can't be compared to either sex or work, because the sexual services takes place only at the buyer's premises, and because no legal rights or union rights will ever ensure prostituted women's protection from the violence and the sexual assault that takes place in prostitution. A Danish survey from last year shows that men who buy sex gets younger and younger. There is a link between the normalization of women being objectified and the liberal attitude towards buying sex. The acceptance of commercialization of women's bodies reduces women into things that can be bought and sold. Survivors of prostitution have seen and experienced how the buyers show a condescending view of and lack of respect for the women they buy. This is because sex buyers can remain completely anonymous and not be held accountable for their actions. We are talking about nice husbands, loving and caring daddies, who show sides of their personality that are hidden from everyone else in their normal life. Sides which are only shown to people at the bottom of the society, the ones who are most vulnerable, ashamed, and marginalized, the prostitutes. I have never, not in my 3 years in prostitution, or in the 4 years I have been out public, met anyone who was in prostitution based on free choices. None of the women I have been in contact with talk about prostitution as sexual liberation. And none of them talk about sex, pleasure, or healthy lives during prostitution. What they talk about is the damage that came as a shock while they were still in or after they left prostitution. They talk about depression, anxiety, thoughts about suicide, PTSD, major problems with the ability to engage in intimate relationships, relationship with men, and especially problems with intimacy and sexuality. The acceptance of an industry where millions of people worldwide are abused and exploited is the same as ignoring all women's right to a life with safe conditions without being objectified or commercialized. Prostitution affects all women, and not only women who are in prostitution. A society's acceptance of prostitution is an oppression of all women as equal human beings. I find it quite interesting that the prostitution debate constantly concerns prostitutes and their free choices. Isn't it time to focus on the buyers and put the spotlight on those who systematically expose people to violence and sexual assaults? But where are they? Why don't they talk about their choices of buying sexual services? Why don't they speak out more often in public? Why don't they tell their wives and their families what they do? Why don't they tell about their aggressive behavior towards prostitutes? Why don't they tell about their violent actions towards prostitutes? Why don't they tell about their constant attempts to exceed the boundaries and limits of the prostitutes? Because they know that no society would accept these actions if they were told by the buyers, if they were told by men. But when women with experiences from prostitution tell about these actions, it's difficult to make people believe that this is really going on in prostitution. Prostitution has nothing to do with the right to decide what to do with your own body. Actually, you don't decide anything in prostitution. Well, maybe you decide a price, maybe you won't do anal, and maybe you won't do it without a condom. But when it comes to boundaries, they are to be slightly exceeded, and the buyers will do all they can to exceed them, because this is one of the things that really turn them on. It turns them on to see how easy it is to get the prostituted woman to do things she didn't want it to or agreed to, because he just had the right amount of money. This is exploitation, and this is male power. This is what some people call sex work. I have never heard about any other occupation where you have to dissociate yourself from what you do. But in prostitution, you have to dissociate, because no human being can take that much violation. Prostitution has never been about the prostitutes. Prostitution is about males' right to violate women, and buying sex degrades the value of all women. Ban the purchase of sex. This is a question about equality and human rights, and if not for you and me, then for our children and the safety of our daughters. They haven't asked for this kind of violation, and we have the ability to protect them from being objectified, commercialized, commodified, and reduced into machines, subjected to being males' sexual property. As you also said, no one dreams about being a prostitute. Prostitution is not a choice. It's a lack of opportunities. Place the responsibility where it belongs. Let the buyers be accountable for their actions by criminalizing them. This is the only way to protect the people who are exploited in the sex industry. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Tanja. Et merci de nous rappeler que les mots sont importants à un moment où on veut de plus en plus nous faire passer, principalement dans les médias, des termes comme travail du sexe, travailleur, travailleuse du sexe. Et il faut vraiment rester extrêmement vigilante et résister pour que ces termes ne s'imposent pas, mais que nous imposions les nôtres. Merci. Je vais maintenant passer la parole à Rosen Hicher et Laurence Noëlle, qui sont les deux femmes qui ont initié le réseau de survivantes en France. Elles ne sont que deux à se produire publiquement, si je peux dire. Il y en a d'autres derrière elles qui n'ont pas encore tout à fait franchi ce pas, ça prend du temps. Elles vont se partager la parole puisque nous voulions laisser bien, surtout voilà, un temps à nos invitées étrangères. Rosen, il y a un mois, jour pour jour, tu es arrivée à Paris au terme d'une marche de 800 km que tu avais initiée. Depuis la ville où tu as eu ta dernière expérience de prostitution jusqu'à Paris, où ça avait commencé, est-ce que tu peux peut-être rapidement nous dire quelques mots? Pourquoi cette marche? Et puis comment, à quel moment, puisque tu dis que tu es venue tardivement, finalement, la prise de conscience que la prostitution était une violence.
Vous savez, j'ai commencé en 88, en mars 88, et à ce moment-là, il n'y avait absolument rien qui était fait pour venir en aide, ou quelques associations, mais les prostituées n'en parlaient pas, parce qu'évidemment, elles sont enchaînées, elles étaient enchaînées. 22 ans après, je vais faire vite pour laisser la parole à Laurence, parce que Laurence, il faut elle a beaucoup de choses à vous dire aussi, c'est important. Et donc, 22 ans après, les prostituées sont toujours enchaînées. Quand je suis partie faire cette marche, c'était aussi pour leur dire, vous avez le droit de parler, n'ayez pas honte. Ce n'est pas vous qui êtes coupable. La honte, ce n'est pas à vous de la porter. La honte, c'est aux clients. Et c'est au proxénète. Je suis partie en guerre un petit peu contre nos politiques parce que les choses n'avançaient pas. Et je trouvais écœurant que le Sénat retire la pénalisation du client parce que c'était laisser le droit au proxénète de vendre les filles. On ne peut pas aller dans un sens, laisser le droit d'un côté à l'achat et interdire la vente. Donc moi, mon combat, ça a été ça. Maintenant, je pense que Laurence pourra aussi expliquer, je veux dire, le mouvement des survivantes en France maintenant.
Merci Rosen. Et donc la parole à... Merci. La parole à Laurence Noëlle, donc survivante également et auteure de l'ouvrage Renaître de ses hontes.
Je fais juste un petit merci à Rosen parce que il faut être honnête que si j'avais pas Rosen, si je n'avais pas les associations abolitionnistes, si je n'avais pas les autres survivantes, eh ben, je serais restée dans mon trou de souris. C'est bien plus confortable. On n'a pas le mépris de la société. On ne renvoie pas de honte. Bref, impeccable. Je peux continuer mon métier tranquille, sans avoir à m'exposer à la haine et au mépris de la société. J'ai connu la prostitution adolescente. J'en suis sortie il y a 29 ans. Et je fais le triste constat que rien n'a changé. 29 ans, rien, enfin, un tout petit peu n'a changé. J'ai connu la prostitution rue Saint-Denis à Paris. 30 clients par nuit, à 16 ans, piégé par un réseau de proxénètes, et les méthodes n'ont pas changé. Les proxénètes utilisent les mêmes pièges pour faire rentrer des femmes ou des adolescents, des adolescentes dans la prostitution. Et c'est le même combat pour s'en sortir. C'est le même combat puisqu'au niveau de la réinsertion, difficile de se réinsérer lorsque la société est sourde et aveugle et nous méprise. Je viens surtout, moi, vous parler aujourd'hui de la réinsertion parce que pourquoi suis-je restée dans le silence pendant 29 ans? Pourquoi d'autres que nous connaissons, Rosen et moi, ne veulent pas parler en public? Et je crois que le problème à l'heure actuelle, c'est que c'est le silence. C'est parce qu'il y a ce qu'il y a une incompréhension de la part de la société. Et c'est parce qu'il y a l'incompréhension de la société qu'il y a ce silence. La seule chose que nous pouvons faire aujourd'hui, et ce qui me tient debout, c'est que toutes nos forces s'unissent ensemble pour que les préjugés, pour briser ces préjugés du style « il faut des putes ». Moi, j'ai pas envie d'être violée. Il faut bien quand même des putes. Et puis, il faut bien quand même... Où est-ce que je vais aller? Ça fait un mois que j'ai pas eu de rapport sexuel. Il faut bien que j'aille me vider les testicules quand même. Donc vraiment, mon cheval de bataille, c'est comment tous ensemble nous unir, vraiment nous unir pour que nous puissions changer ce regard. Parce que la personne prostituée, déjà, elle vit des violences, mais ça continue à être violent après la sortie de la prostitution. Puisqu'il n'y a rien pour elle, et puisque de toute façon, il n'y a rien au niveau de l'écoute. La société n'accueille pas cette souffrance. Elle ne veut pas l'entendre, alors elle fantasme, elle prend des stratégies un petit peu d'évitement pour surtout pas entendre cette violence et cette souffrance de la prostitution. Allez dire, vous allez devant un employeur et vous dites « Bonjour monsieur, oui, ça fait 5 ans que je me prostitue. Vous avez sûrement moins de chances de trouver un travail que si vous avez fait autre chose dans votre vie que de la prostitution. » Je dois faire court pour que nous respections le temps. Le temps, je vois plus rien de toute façon. À chaque fois, j'ai un peu le trac, il n'y a rien à faire. Oui, et je voudrais juste lancer quelque chose qui me tient à cœur. J'en ai marre Les journalistes, aujourd'hui, dans ce projet de loi, ne parlent que de la pénalisation du client. Là encore, c'est nier la souffrance des personnes prostituées qui ont connu la souffrance, qui ont connu la prostitution, qui la connaissent encore. Mais bon sang, le projet de loi, ça n'est pas uniquement que la pénalisation du client. Comment est-ce qu'on peut nier toutes ces parties de prévention, de réinsertion, de formation pour les travailleurs sociaux? Pourquoi les journalistes ne diffusent pas, ne transmettent pas tout la globalité de ce projet de loi, la pénalisation du client? S'il ne veut pas comprendre, il doit être pénalisé. C'est une façon de se responsabiliser. Si le client il a compris, s'il prend conscience de son acte, très bien. Mais celui qui ne veut pas comprendre, il doit être pénalisé. Mais parlons, s'il vous plaît, que ce message soit diffusé, que ce projet de loi, ça n'est pas que ça. Pour que ces personnes, que toutes ces personnes prostituées puissent enfin sortir de la honte, sortir du silence, être accueillies. Elles ont vécu la prostitution. Elles ne sont pas des prostituées, elles ne sont pas des ex-prostituées. Nous avons survécu, mais nous sommes bien plus que ça. On a été au fond du puits, on a touché à l'humiliation, aux violences. Nous sommes sortis du puits, mais pour cela, on a besoin de l'aide de la société tout entière pour accueillir ça. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup Laurence, je suis sûre que l'appel a été entendu et d'ailleurs nous sommes toutes et tous réunis ici pour ça justement. Merci. Et maintenant pour terminer ce panel, après avoir entendu donc les 5 personnes s'exprimer, je vais laisser, et je suis très heureuse de l'accueillir, Tanja bien-aimée, qui est la directrice de la coalition contre la traite des femmes, CATW, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, qui est notre discutante sur ce panel. Je vais lui laisser la tâche difficile de rapidement, pour que nous soyons dans les temps, mais tu as quelques minutes, Tanja, peut-être nous dire ses réactions sur ce qu'elle a entendu et puis la manière dont cela fait écho avec le travail mené par la CATW.
Merci Claire, merci à tout le monde au New Cap International. Donc, quelques minutes. So I will speak in English. I think I was asked to speak in English. Et merci les traducteurs. So, first of all, as Claire mentioned, words are especially words that come out of pain, are very, very difficult to surface. Many of us have started to work in this movement to end trafficking and prostitution for decades. And at a time when the survivors were there but quiet and had not yet surfaced the way they have. And listening to the panel here today, to the panelists, to the survivors, and to Fatima and others, there's a sense of deep respect and awe and gratitude. We as advocates and allies can talk all we want, but they speak the truth. And what they are doing is nothing short of a revolution. And I just wanted to applaud them and recognize them for their courage and their vision. Thank you. So, being an activist, I have 4 points because we need to take action. This is an incredible opportunity with the growing survivor movement around the world to really take our forces worldwide and really magnify our resources, our voices, and our commitment to abolish prostitution and end sex trafficking. So my first point would be UN Women. As Pierrette mentioned, UN Women never ceases to disappoint us in their views with prostitution. Some of you may know that last year they issued a quote-unquote unofficial unofficial note calling for legalization of prostitution. Equality Now and the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women have been trying to ask UN Women to retract this unofficial note, or at least to issue a statement claiming their neutrality on the issue of prostitution, to no avail. We have to go to the top donor countries, the United States and top European countries, including Ireland, France, Finland, Sweden, Norway, are major donors of the United Nations. We have tried to reach out to them and ask them to engage with UN Women on this issue. You cannot, as an institution, they cannot work against sexual violence, sexual harassment, economic empowerment, peace, and leave out prostitution. Prostitution is not an exception to violence and discrimination against women and girls. My second point is, as Tanja mentioned, the notion of sex work. When we first started, only the pro-sex industry lobbyists uses the term sex work. And now, especially in the United States, and whether it's travailleurs de sexe or in the equivalent in any other language, the term is creeping up in our culture everywhere, in our newspapers increasingly, on the street. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, with over 300 organizations, have sent a letter to the Associated Press urging them not to use the term sex work. The lobby, the pro-prostitution people have asked the Associated Press to change the term from prostitute to sex work. And so I would urge each of you to join the campaign in whichever country you are. And I am sure that the equivalent newspapers also have the same debate. So please, this is also an incredible opportunity for us to let the survivors with whom we work speak out loud and let them know that sex work, it is neither sex nor work, it is violence against women. Third is Beijing Plus 20. Those of you who will come to the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, we are hoping that you can join us. We would like to, as everyone here, really build alliances. I'm very happy to see that there will be a panel this afternoon with the trade worker unions. We need to increase our alliances with unlikely partners. I am thrilled to report that we have been in touch with Dr. Ingeborg Kraus, who initiated the petition of mental health providers and trauma experts in Germany calling for the abolition of prostitution and for the Nordic Model in Germany. And she will come to CSW 59. Again, any of you who have connections with the mental health community, it is critically important for people to understand about the harms of prostitution. As many of the survivors have said, the harms are invisible, the trauma is invisible, the pain is invisible, but it's in plain sight at the same time, and we need to recognize that knowledge is power, and once people understand the true nature of prostitution, they will take action with us. And then finally is the Nordic Model, or demand-focused legislation. I urge the government of France to follow Norway, Iceland, and Sweden to look at prostitution as a form of violence against women and to penalize demand. I'd like to commend our Canadian friends who in 30 days will have, or less now, will have the Canadian version of the Nordic Model, but nevertheless, we are thrilled. And other countries in the works, hopefully, that are waiting for upper house approval: Israel, Ireland, and Northern Ireland. So again, I think these are just 4 points of action. This is our time. This is the survivors' time, and they alone will tell the truth in a way that has never been told before, and it is our responsibility and our duty and our privilege and honor to support the survivor leadership groups around the world. Thank you very much.